Hey, good WordPress people. Welcome back to the WPMRR WordPress podcast. I'm Joe.
And I am Darth Sidious.
And you're listening to the WordPress Business Podcast. Darth Sidious on the pod this week. I love when people pick dark characters or evil characters, because most people pick the good characters, but you went with a dark one this time. And you were BB-8 last time, so you get to be a bad character this time. What's going on?
Not too much. Yeah, that Darth Sidious, that choice is brought to you by my daughter, who tends to also like the dark characters. She loves Darth
Nice.
Vader and Darth Sidious and Count Dooku, so got to represent the Sith.
Yeah, totally. The dark characters have a place in this too. It's this balance of good and evil, and you can't have all the good without some of the evil as well. Plus, some of those evil characters are some of the coolest and have some of the coolest makeup and costume stuff. So I'm down with that. Sounds cool.
And Sidious is just a talk about bad guy who executed his plan nearly perfectly, right? Over the span of like 60 or 70 years. Just impressive.
Yeah, that is totally true. Almost like exactly nailed it. Exactly. Yeah. Over a long period of time. I mean, he was a senator and he played the game pretty well, you have to admit, even though he's a bad character. So Darth Sidious on the podcast this week, also known as the one and only, the great and powerful Joe Casabona. What's going on, Joe?
Not too much. I'm good. I'm glad we can get together back on the pod. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, man. Yeah, it's your second time on the pod, and man, we've known each other for a long time. So it even seems weird to talk about how we met or that stuff, because we've known each other in WordPress Space for so long at this point. But yeah, you're always up to something new in the WordPress community or with your WordPress work. People can go and listen to your last episode and hear about all the amazing stuff you do in WordPress, but maybe let's do an update and tell people what some of the new stuff you're working on now.
Yeah, so the things that I do mostly these days are podcasting, course and video creation, and as we record this, I am sending the last of my new book to layout with my publisher. So I've got a book coming out on HTML and CSS. That's being published through Pearson. And yeah, so I'll be happy to wrap that up. And then again, as we record this, I'll have a second child on the way very soon.
That is a big new thing for sure. Listeners know I've got a 6-month-old at home now, so I've got number one. And you, Joe, were actually one of the people who I was talking to before Morrison was born, being like, okay, what's it like to have a baby? Can you still work? Can you do anything? What's going on? And so you were one of those people that definitely guided me through this. And hey, if we decide we want a second at some point, I guess you can be my guide again. Tell me about what's like to have two. Let's start there. How are you feeling? Are you feeling a little nervous? You kind of feeling cool, calm, collected? What's going on in your head right now?
I'm feeling a little bit nervous because I have two major projects I need to wrap up pretty much before my son comes. And so that added pressure, because I don't want to work once he's here, especially because it'll be now we're gonna have to switch to man-to-man defense, right? Because we'll have two. So I want to be there as a supportive father and a supportive husband, and I don't want to be distracted by the major project. So I'm gonna barrel through and get all this done, and so I can be fully present when my son is born.
Yeah, that's always a little bit stressful because you don't really know when the baby's coming. Sure, it could be right at 9 months or 9.5 months, but also could be a little bit early. When does the deadline come? Are you trying? And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but your wife's expecting in the next few weeks here, so you've got kind of a deadline here coming up, right?
Yeah, she is 39 weeks today as we record this, so wow. Due date's exactly 1 week from today. Teresa was right on time. She was born at 11:06 p.m. the day before her due date, so just an hour before her due date, because Casabonas are always on time. And so it's he could come early, or he could be right on time. But yeah, we're like in crunch time right now. So
Nice. All right. Well, by the time this episode goes live, you will probably have two kids. You'll have your new one here. So if you're listening to this episode, go and give Joe congratulations. You can probably hit him up on Twitter. He's just Jay Casabona, right?
that is correct. And
All
thank you.
right. Yes, no problem. Yeah, I'll give him a little shout out. I'll be on Twitter. I'll be like, "Hey, Joe, how you doing? Everything good?" But yeah, man, two is more than one. I like that expression. People say, "Okay, going from like,
Yeah.
one person's in the you have one kid at home, one person's in the game, one person's on the bench getting a breather,
Yeah,
or you have 2-on-1. Now it's 1-on-1,
it's one
and
on
then what
one.
the next step is like totally zone defense,
Got to
and
go
that
zone defense. Yeah, my father-in-law said you're not a real parent until you have three, and I'm like, great.
yeah. You think your skills are
Yeah,
advanced with one or two. Oh yeah,
yeah,
just try
yeah.
with juggling with three.
But
Cool. Well, congratulations, Joe. That's really exciting for you, man. I'm pumped.
thank you.
And finishing up a few projects before that gets done. Obviously, you're a podcaster, and people know you as being a podcaster in the WordPress space. And How I Built It's pretty popular. And now you're not just running a podcast, but you're actually helping other people with podcast stuff too, which I think is pretty cool. So tell us a little bit about the kind of work you're doing there too.
Yeah, for sure. So I've been podcasting for 7 years or so now, and I've had a successful one for it's 4 years this month actually that I launched How I Built It.
Nice.
So that's been a lot of fun, and I do get a lot of questions around how do I start a podcast? What do I do? How how did you grow and things like that? How are you making money? And at first, I figured that the market was pretty saturated with like a podcasting course because lots of people have those. And I decided to just launch a build your podcast website course. And then I realized that nobody needed a website for a thing that they didn't have, right? Like so I was, if we're going back to the Star Wars analogy, I was sending Luke to fight Darth Vader, not without mastery of the Force, like without a lightsaber. I was just like,
Wow.
go fight Darth Vader. Um, and so I took a step back and I created a new course called Podcast Liftoff that shows you everything you need to do to plan, produce, and publish your podcast, and then you get the website course for free. So once you have your show, if you want to build your own website, then you can.
Yeah, cool. So it's everything podcasting. I remember starting this podcast, and it was a lot of work. It was a lot of stuff to do and a lot of things I didn't know. You know, when you're going through and saying, okay, I have an idea for a podcast. Okay, how do you get from like, I have a great idea for podcasts, I'm motivated, I want to go do this, to actually get from there to having your podcast like on all the players and like having a system down for how you're publishing and like what's my content about, like how am I like targeting an audience and like giving valuable content, and am I planning out each episode, how do I edit my audio, like there's were all questions I kind of had to answer along the way. And I remember totally kind of flying by the seat of my pants and being like, well, this is the decision I'm making today, or this is the decision I'm making tomorrow. And it would have probably been helpful to have like a pretty good guide of someone who's done it before and has run a successful podcast. So, maybe our next podcast will have a little bit more help doing it this time. But yeah, maybe I'd love to chat like about this, like starting off of the podcast, because I'm sure that there are other listeners here who are like, I would love to do a podcast. I even have an idea for a podcast. Like what are the good first steps people should be taking in terms of like making it easier to actually like get started with podcasting?
Yeah, for sure. Well, let me just say that you're absolutely right. I had no idea what I was doing when I first started either. I didn't even know I needed like a separate audio host. Jackie Dalia informed me of that. She's like, "Who are you hosting your audio with?" And I'm like, "I don't know, WordPress." And
Yeah.
she's like, "Probably don't do that." So shout out to Jackie for like making sure I got off on the right foot. Um, but starting a podcast is choosing your topic and your format are critical, right? Because you can't. I mean, everybody says this about everything. Don't just start something to make money, but like, don't just start a podcast to try to make money because you'll be disappointed in the beginning. You
Mm,
will lose steam quickly, and if you're not passionate about the topic, then you'll have no drive whatsoever. So the first thing I tell people is podcasting is a great way to grow your business. I believe it's the next content plane, and I am proof positive of that. My business would not be self-employed without my podcast. That's how helpful it's been for me.
mm,
Um, and the topic I picked was one that I was passionate and curious about. I was having conversations with people about how they started their businesses to get insight on how I should run my business. And I thought this should be a podcast. So it was a topic I was passionate about. I was asking the right questions. And you should make a list of topics for yourself when you're ready to pick yours. So,
totally.
things that you're interested in that you want to be known for, especially if you are going to try to grow your business here. How do you want to establish yourself as an expert? In what field do you want to be seen as the go-to person? That's where I would start for picking a topic because it's something that you're going to have a depth of knowledge of that you won't need a ton of motivation to talk about. And if if you're if you are an expert in the field, you won't necessarily need to do a ton of research in the beginning, right? So we're lowering that barrier of entry for you.
Mm,
Um, and then the second part of that, before I stop on this very long-winded answer, is your format. A lot of people are like, I should just do interviews, or I need to do one specific format. You don't. Mix it up. Do solo shows where you talk about some topic for 15 or 20 minutes and bring on guests that can help reinforce your points or teach your audience and you about something new. I learned so much from my guests on how to run my business better that I can then pass that information on to my audience. So mix up the format, make it easier on yourself, and pick a topic that you know a lot about and you're very passionate about.
yeah, I love all that advice, and it's all like resonating with me so much thinking about starting this podcast. One thing I'd add to that is because you mentioned like be flexible around your like formatting of your content. I think this is super, super important. So I think a lot of people start a podcast and say I have to keep it super consistent. Like I have to like deliver my format the same way every time. And there's some established podcasts you listen to that have the like exact same formatting every time. It's really well produced. It's really like nice to listen to, and that's great. But it does not have to be everybody. Like if you decide after a few episodes, like I want to do a guest appearance, go do it. See what works, see what doesn't work. Like our podcast, I think listeners know at this point, we're like a pretty informal podcast. Like it has good audio production, but it's not like, formatted or it's not engineered like some of these super like TED Radio Hour, podcasts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But like Christy and I started the podcast. We did the first 10 episodes or so together. And then one day I was like, I want to talk to some other people. So I started having guests on, and that's literally how it started. I didn't put a ton of thought into it. I was just like, I want to talk to more people. I want to put more people in front of other folk, in front of our audience. And like selfishly, I want to learn from them. Like I totally agree with you, Joe. So many people I've talked to in this podcast, I've learned so much from. Like I would never know anything about like the like iPad Pro or like what pen I should use to like, write beautifully had I not talked to you last time. So like, these are things that like help me. And if you can help yourself, you're helping your audience. Like after episodes, I'm like, man, I just learned so much. I know that's a good episode because like the audience is, it's like the kid in the room who is brave enough to ask the question. 10 other kids probably have the same question too.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I totally agree with all that stuff. What about, so I think the place where a lot of people get stuck is the audio engineering piece or the editing of the
Mm-hmm.
audio. Like how do you go from anybody can sit down and record a podcast episode by themselves with someone else. Like that part's actually not too hard. You get recordings together and you have audio and you can turn that into a podcast. But how do you like do the audio editing piece? For some people, they may want to learn it, and maybe that's something that you go over a little bit in your course. Some people may want to try and find someone to hire who can, maybe not the $100 an hour person, but maybe there are some folks out there who can, for 10 or $20 an hour, like do a little audio engineering for you and make your podcast episode sound good. What do you recommend about bridging that gap for folks who are like, I have a podcast, I can do all the recording. Ooh, how do I go from like having my audio to like making it sound good and like putting it out there in the world so that people won't like hate it because the audio quality is so crappy?
Yeah, for sure. And I would say like absolutely, like you do not need to sound like Joe or me when you're first starting out. Again, I've been podcasting for a long time. This is not my first podcast microphone that I'm using. And I am like a stickler for my own mic quality more than I should be. Uh, you will spend a little bit of money here, but it's not in the grand scheme of things, it's not a lot. For $60, you can get a decent built-in, or I'm sorry, a decent external microphone. For let's say $300, you can get an upgraded microphone and what's called an interface. So you have it's an XLR microphone where that's what you see on stages, right? Like if you go to a concert or a speaking event, it's a microphone that can go into a piece of hardware that will make your voice sound better right off the bat. But that's the next step. I think if you're starting out, the ATR 2100 is the microphone for you. It is, again, $60-$70. It's a USB microphone that actually converts to an XLR microphone. And it's going to give you a much cleaner sound going into your computer. And it's pretty forgiving of the environment too. And that's the second thing that you want to do to make your life easier is try your best to treat your environment for audio. So don't be in an echoey room, and make sure you have at least some way that the sound is being deflected away from your microphone. This could be bookshelves behind you, or I know people like Mike Rowe, the Dirty Jobs guy, right? He if he's recording at home, he will record in his closet with a comforter over him, because clothes are a great way to dampen sound and echo. So like
Totally.
I've recorded a course like that where I put a comforter over my head and I recorded. So just anything to make your audio sound better going into the computer is going to make your life a lot easier. And then you have two paths, as Joe alluded to. If you want to edit your own episodes, I would recommend Audacity. It is free, it's open source and cross-platform, and there are a lot of tutorials on it, including one in my podcast Liftoff course on how to remove white noise, how to cut and do transitions and things like that. Or you can go the hired editor route. And again, you don't have to pay $100 an hour to somebody. I pay my editor something like $30 or $40 an episode. And he just puts my guest's audio with my audio. He cleans it up a little and he inserts ad spots, and that saves me hours a week. So I found him on Fiverr. If you want, I can give Joe a link to him for the show notes or whatever, but you don't have to spend a ton. If you're starting out, try it out and see if you're going to edit. But treating your audio going into your computer is going to massively help you in the editing process as well.
Yeah. I have a lot of thoughts there, but one is when I started doing podcasting, I always hated the sound of my voice, which I think a lot of people can resonates with a lot of people. Like I remember like hearing my voice on like an audio message machine, like growing up, I couldn't stand it. I was like, oh, it's like cringe worthy. And it really turns out it's just that the audio quality was so bad. Yeah, maybe some people have better like speaking voices for like radio or podcast. Maybe that's true to a certain degree. But when we got our audio engineer to produce our podcast, I remember the first time I heard the final version of it with this like really, really cleaned up audio, really high quality, and thinking like, oh my God, I actually kind of sound good. Like, this is great. I've never heard myself sound like this. So it really does make a huge difference, not just for the quality other people are listening to, but like for liking to do the podcast and liking to hear yourself on the podcast. That's just something that I always remember. And still to this day, I'm like, how do I sound like this on the podcast? It's like, sounds good. Like and high quality audio is really the answer. And I think for people starting off, like, I did a podcast before I did this podcast, which was totally like a warm up into podcasting. It was called, it was like the Walking Marvin podcast. Marvin's my dog. And it was just like I don't think the website's up anymore, but it was walkingmarvin.dog. And I just walk Marvin and like talk about stuff and like, business things, etc. And it was not a great podcast, like the quality of the audio, because I was just talking into my microphone on my back then it was with no AirPods. It was with wired headphones for my iPhone, but it's fine to get started with something like that. I would for sure say if you have $60 to invest in it, that it will really help the audio quality to have even a basic microphone. But if you really just want to, if you're starting podcasting, you're not going to be great at it the first episode. You're probably not going to be great at it your first 10 episodes. This is going to be episode like 100 plus 103 maybe of the podcast. And I don't really consider myself that great at it. It's a work in progress. And so if you start off like with that expectation, I think you'll be much better off, because like you said, Joe, like podcasts it's hard to build a business on a podcast. You really have to grow a really pretty big audience to do that. And like this podcast, it throws a few customers to WP Buffs. It throws a few people to WPMRR and the stuff we're doing there. But it's like definitely, we probably like at the end of the day lose money on it. I don't know.
Gotcha.
I don't know. It's a complicated equation, but like it's not a profit center for sure. Like it's not a place where I'm like, we got to keep doing the podcast because we're making so much money on it. It's like I like doing it, and WP Buffs helps to fund it, and that's great. And I get to talk to cool people like you. So at the end of the day, I think, I just talked about a lot of thoughts, but I have thoughts apparently.
Yeah. Well, I mean, but I think you're right. You need to get your reps in. That's what I tell people, right? Because I was asked about this at a WordCamp in September, but in the before time when we could go to WordCamps, and they're like, "How do you get comfortable in front of the microphone?" And I said, I was in drama club. I have always been comfortable performing or being in front of people, but being in front of a microphone is a little bit different, and you need to practice and do it. Record a few demo episodes for just you, right? And listen. They never have to be released if you hate them, but you will find your sea legs, right? You will become better. You'll understand what you can do to improve some of the things that you do that you might want to stop doing. And the more you do it, the better you'll get. And as for, we're not all gonna be Joe Rogan as far as making money is concerned, but this can be good, consistent content for you. And one of the stats that I keep saying is there are 31 million YouTube channels and there are less than 1 million active podcasts. And only about 50% of Americans listen to podcasts right now. So there is plenty of room to grow in this field. And if you start now, then you will be on a new platform, a new plane of content where you can grow your business, especially as more people start to listen to podcasts.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I don't know about you, but like I just got offered $100 million deal by Spotify. So, maybe you're not the biggest podcast, but this podcast is huge, man. I'm just,
I'm hoping. I think they're just snatching up all the Joes right now. So,
right. There you go. Yeah.
In reverse
Joe Rogan followed by Joe Casabona, followed by Joe Howard. Yeah. Obviously. That's a good strategy for them. I see.
Yeah.
I think another thing about podcasting is I feel like, having a podcast in the WordPress space, and this very well, it gives you this platform and this voice to speak to people. And as you grow your audience a little bit, you start to get shared around the WordPress space. And, this could be in any industry, but you start to become kind of someone that people listen to in your industry. And I find that very interesting for the reason that, like, I know a few things about entrepreneurship. Like, I've grown a semi-successful business. Like, I know some things, but there's so much I don't know. And I started a podcast, which I think, like, I'm supposed to be like an expert in stuff because I started a podcast and I talk about things, and like that makes me an expert. But like it's kind of the other way around. Like if you just keep doing a podcast and you like kind of grow into your space, like you'll start to like gain a smaller audience and then maybe a medium-sized audience, and it'll grow. But it's almost like you become like a whatever quote unquote expert, or like you happen to know things, and it's because of the podcast. It's like I don't know things and I'm like giving it out to people. It's more like I think people like think like maybe me and you, like we know stuff, but it's because we have a podcast. Of course they must know stuff, but it's not like really like that. Like people who listen to this podcast know I always say like I don't know like about a ton of stuff because there's a ton of stuff I don't know about. But I think that like I would for sure advise people to like don't worry about being an influencer or like being one of the voices in your industry. Like that will come just once you've done a podcast for a year. And I've only been doing it for like a year and a half, and you've been doing it for years. So like at this point, it's like people know us from the podcast, but it's really just because we just did it for a while, and people eventually were like, oh, fine, like I guess I'll listen. And now we have a good amount of listeners. So yeah.
That's like, sorry, I'm sorry, you're in the middle of a thought.
No, go ahead. Go.
Yeah. That's the power. I think that's so powerful in podcasting because it's a more intimate medium, right? Like people who are listening to this right now, they're probably listening on headphones and they're hearing the inflection in our voice, right? Like if we wrote this stuff, our personalities wouldn't shine through as much. And so as a result, people feel like they know us a little better, and therefore they trust us a little better, and they view us as experts. And this is if you're thinking about starting a podcast, this is really important for you. You are always going to be ahead of somebody, right? You don't need to be the number one business person on the planet to give out advice, right? And this is stuff I learned from my podcast. Brian Krogsgaard just said this to me in one of our interviews the other day. But you're always going to be a step ahead of somebody, and somebody will be able to learn from you. So if you make your content relatable and give them quick wins, they will absolutely trust you and view you as an expert because they are learning from you and growing with you.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Because the world is so big.
Mm-hmm.
And the podcast space is so big, and the WordPress space is actually pretty big. So there are always going to be folks who are just a step behind you or a few steps behind you. And what's also interesting is that your content, once you put it up there, can last forever. So someone in 10 years could come and find something that's useful for them, some evergreen content that you wrote or you put it in a podcast. So,
and people prefer different content, like in different ways, right? Some people prefer to read because that's how they consume information. But, if reading is cognitively taxing for people, or they are driving somewhere and they can't read, but they still want to consume some content, a podcast is perfect for that. They can listen and consume the content that way. So cover your bases. Make sure that you're catering to all of the people who want to learn from you in different ways, whether that's having a podcast and a transcript or taking a blog post and turning that into a podcast episode and repurposing that content.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point about like the purpose of repurposing content, which is that people absorb it's not just people with different learning methods, right? It's like some people are visual, some people are audio, some people want to like read. Obviously, that's one reason to put content in different mediums, but also people just absorb content it's not just like a learning method. It's like the time of day, or like like sometimes I'm on a walk with my dog and I want to put a podcast in, and that would be audio. But when I'm walking my dog, I'm not going to put a YouTube video on. But if
Right.
I'm working on my computer, I got this big, huge, gaming monitor. Like I'll have my work on one side, and maybe I want to listen to something while I'm working. Oh, the YouTube's going to be better because I can just literally go to youtube.com. I'm subscribed to Joe Casabona right on YouTube, so I can go and just listen to, his recent podcast episode or his recent unboxing or whatever. And so I think just having content for different pieces, or for those different pieces, is also super important. So that's a good point.
Absolutely. And it's a quick win for people who are wondering, how do I come up with consistent content? You've probably, unless today's your first day on the internet, you've probably created content in some way. And that is prime for repurposing and resurfacing, because you put out a podcast episode about a 5-year-old blog post. Guess what? You can send more traffic to that blog post too.
Yeah. It's a snowball effect of when you're starting off, like when I started WP Buffs, like it was nothing. And I had to work every day to write another blog post. Please don't go to the first 20 blog posts written on WPBuffs.com. They're so bad, but like, that's how you get started. And I actually keep them up for that reason, because maybe people will find them and be like, this sucks. And it's good. Yes, it did suck at the beginning for sure. That's how you get started. And I'm fine with people seeing that stuff actually. But like when I started the podcast, like we got started somewhat more quickly because we already had like a small email list of WP Buffs. We had a little, so it kind of snowballed into other things. And I think it's important for people to keep that expectation of like, if like the podcast is the first thing you're starting, like no one's going to listen to it for a long time, probably. Maybe not a long time, but like you should be expecting like your first year not getting a ton of traction. And if you can like keep that expectation in your head, because it's like, I feel like a lot of people will get down on themselves. Like after a month, I did like 4 episodes and like no one's listening. I got like 10 downloads, and it like 3 of them were my mom, which was how like a lot of our stuff started too. Like my mom actually like recently replied to one of our WP Buffs tweets. And I was like, thanks, Mom.
Nice.
Like, nice. Yeah, it's helping us get that engagement. But it's you got to be ready to like put that grind and work in. It's like, it's like what people say about like being like a professional athlete. It's like all the work you do when the cameras are off is what makes a difference. And that's just this part. It's being a podcaster is no different than being a professional athlete. We'll make a good parallel there. It's,
that's exactly what I tell people too. Like I'm a professional athlete is what I tell people.
Professional audio athlete. There you go.
Yeah, exactly. But you're right. And instead of saying like I only got 10 downloads, you should be like, I got 10 people were interested enough in me to listen to me talk for 20 or 30 minutes. Like that's really nice, because time is, I think Bill Gates said this, time is the only thing that you can't buy more of, right? So the fact that anybody is willing to give you their time, especially when you're just starting out, is something to celebrate, whether it's 10 people or 10,000 people.
Yeah, I agree. And people like Joe and me, Joe, and anybody who's a huge podcaster or huge anybody in their space, they started with 10. Like I remember getting our first like email subscribers and be like, oh my God, people are giving us their email address. Like you dummies, I can't believe you actually did that. And now we get like a bunch every day, and it's like kind of an afterthought, right? But it all started there. And so that's where everybody starts. So if anybody's out there who's like got 10 listens and they're feeling a little down or something, like that's good. It's you have to be there and go through that little bit of that struggle period to get to where you want to be. Because if it was that, my dad always said, like, if it was that, like when I studied math in college, like I was a mathematics major. And it was hard, like very hard. But my dad always said, well, if it was easy, everybody would do it. You'd see a ton of math majors out there, but it's not easy. That's why it's good that it's hard, Think about that. It's good. It's good that things are hard. Let's wrap up a little bit and talk a little bit about video, because I think video is a cool area that you're also into. And maybe, I don't know if I'd say like another step up from audio. Maybe it's like a similar step. I don't know how you think about it, but to me, video is like, not only do people have to hear you, but like they see you on video. That's a little bit more pressure. And it's like, okay, obviously that like need some sort of video equipment to do this sort of setup, but let's like stay with the basics and just talk about like what kind of like video can people get started with, since video is such a huge growing piece of marketing, and just like the internet, like video is just it's always been big and it will continue to grow, I think. But like, how can people like really get started with video in like a somewhat simple way?
Yeah, this is, if we're talking about like professional services that I offer, the video stuff is a much easier sell right now. I think more companies and brands are realizing that they need video, and it's because YouTube is so huge, right? And it's easier to discover videos because there is YouTube, right? There's not a YouTube of podcasting yet, at least. I think Spotify is probably trying to be that, but we're probably a couple of years out from that still.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a whole YouTube algorithm thing. So to answer your question, um, if you don't have like a rockin' camera, if you have something that is uh, just the built-in camera, I think that if you want to do in front of the camera stuff, you should probably at least get a webcam. But if you can't, lighting, I think, is the most important thing.
Mm.
Because if you've ever taken a picture, maybe not before the current set of phones that have like that night mode now, but
Yeah.
if you've ever taken a picture with a camera in daylight and then at night, the night picture is going to be grainy because the camera has to work harder to get a clear picture. Same thing for your webcam. If you are in a dark room, you're going to just look bad because the camera has to work harder. Make its job easier by setting up a couple of lights for like 20 or 30 bucks. You can get a couple of white lights that you could put on your desk, and that's going to improve your picture a lot.
Yeah.
But if you could do screencast stuff, it doesn't matter what camera you have, right? You just would need most computers come with screen recording software. On a Mac, you can use QuickTime. If you want to step up a little bit, you can get ScreenFlow or Camtasia, which is both Windows and PC. I'm sorry, Windows and Mac. But when you're thinking about what kind of videos to put out, again, determine how you want to establish yourself as an expert in your field, and then figure out what you want to teach people. So again, if it's a screencast, walk them through something step by step. Narrate everything that you do. Script if you need to. If it's a talking head video, again, dole out some advice. It's not going to be as long as a podcast. 3 to 7 minutes, 3 to 10 minutes. I would say, I think the YouTube algorithm favors, it changes all the time, so who knows? I'm not a YouTube expert, but it seems to favor like that 7 to 9 minute content. And that's probably the amount of attention that you have for a viewer as well. Some of the YouTubers I like have like 17-minute videos, and sometimes I break those into 2 sessions, right? Because I'm like eating lunch and I watch half the video and then I come back later. Which is like, that's kind of sad, right? That like I'm only taking 10 minutes for lunch. That's a whole other thing. But the point is, determine the kind of content you want to put out. If you're doing talking head videos, make sure if you can't get a really nice camera, at least have good lighting, or start with screencasts where you show somebody step by step how to do something with the tools that you use on your computer.
Yeah, I think all good advice. Cool, man. I think that's probably a good place to wrap up. We talked about audio, we talked about video. Let's tell people, where can they find all the stuff you talked about, your course, some of your video stuff, also maybe some of the tools that you use. I know we didn't talk a ton about tools, and people are always like, well, what does Joe use? Like, I want to know what he, I know you have a page up with all the stuff you use too.
Yeah, for sure. So all of my stuff you can find at we talked about a lot of things actually. So by the time this comes out, there will be a page on my website, casabona.org/ we'll just say Joe. Hopefully that's not taken already. Make it really easy, casabona.org/ Joe, and that will take you to a bunch of resources. But if you are looking for anything that you want to do right now, my blog is casabona.org. My podcast course, Podcast Liftoff, is at podcastliftoff.com. You can get 25% off with the code BuffTastic. And then I'm on YouTube. So if you search for Joe Casabona on YouTube, I'll have breakdowns of my recording gear and my video gear. But again, if you're looking for like a hub, casabona.org/Joe will have everything.
Nice, cool. And he's Jay Casabona on Twitter. So if you want to give him a follow, he's a WordPress influencer. He's one of those people you have to follow. So give him a follow on Twitter.
Making me
last thing
over here.
Last thing I ask guests for is just ask our listeners for a little 5-star iTunes review. So if you wouldn't mind giving them a little ask, I'd appreciate it.
Yeah, definitely give this rating and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts, because it helps people discover the show. So please do that.
Yeah, thank you, man. And in the comments, leave something you learned about this episode. Maybe like a thanks, Joe C, because you got to be explicit about which Joe you're thanking. We'll shoot him a screenshot and say thanks for the review. And it's cool to hear what you learned so we can do more episodes about those kind of topics. If you're a new listener to the WPMRR WordPress podcast, go through some old episodes. We've got 100 plus old episodes for you to binge. And we've gone through any topic you probably could have thought of. We've probably got some content on it. So go through and check out some older episodes. If you have questions for us at the show, shoot them in to yo@wpmrr.com. We like to answer questions live on the podcast. Chrissy and I have a few Q&A episodes. They've been really fun to do, and we would love to do more. So any questions you have around monthly recurring revenue or podcasts, video, or anything around growing and running your WordPress business or business in general, just let us know. We'll answer some questions. That is all for this week. We'll be in your podcast player again next Tuesday. Joe, thanks again for being on, man. It's been real.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.